Hi everyone. Hallo iedereen. Nou, hartstikke fijn dat jullie erbij kunnen zijn. We hebben vanavond, spreken we deels in het Nederlands en deels in het Engels. Ik ben Ninke Bloemberg, Modeconservator bij het Centraal Museum. And I'll switch to English right away. I'm Ninke Bloemberg, Fashion Curator of the Centraal Museum, and one of the curators of the Voices of Fashion exhibition. And I'm really honored to have these guests here with us. Let me start with Lesiba. Lesiba, you are now where? In Pretoria?
In Midrand, which is right in the middle of Johannesburg and Pretoria.
Okay, really happy to have you here. And your background is dancing, fashion design.
Yeah, so I started fashion design in 2006, and then I went into performance art whilst I was living in Cape Town. That I all completed in 2018. And now with Erica, I co-direct African Fashion Research Institute.
Yeah, you are co-director of AFRI, and that's what connects you at least at this moment. But you have a longer history together, right, Erica? Hi, welcome as well. Where are you based at the moment?
Thank you so much, Ninke. Thank you. I'm based in Cape Town in South Africa. That's also where Lesiba and our path really started in Cape Town. But now we're co-directors of AFRI. We launched AFRI, and as with so much of the world, we kind of run this virtually from 2 different places in South Africa. So yeah, I'm in Cape Town at the moment.
And your background is a researcher, historian?
You know what, I studied fashion design, so I even worked as a fashion designer. I ran a small clothing factory, but then I also was very involved in lecturing. So I lectured for many years and built curricula and contributed to kind of course development. And then eventually sort of went further into research and curatorial work. So recently done some fashion curation and continuing with writing and research.
We're going to hear a lot more about it.
Yeah.
Marian Duff, jij zit nu in Amsterdam, denk ik.
Om precies te zijn in Diemen, maar dat kun je wel bescharen onder Amsterdam.
Ja, precies. Nou, fijn dat je erbij bent. We kennen jou, de meeste van jou zullen je kennen van OSCAM, waar je natuurlijk net een mooi, prachtig nieuwe plek geopend. Waar je natuurlijk de founder, de oprichter van bent. Wil je iets meer ook vertellen over jouw achtergrond?
Ik denk dat ik autodidact ben met alles wat ik doe. Ik heb een journalistieke achtergrond, maar dat heb ik lang geleden achter me gelaten. Ik heb MAFB opgezet. Dat is een internationale modecommunity waarmee we verschillende activiteiten hebben gedaan rondom diversiteit in de mode. Vervolgens 3 jaar geleden OSCAM opgezet. Dat staat voor Open Space Contemporary Art Museum in Amsterdam Zuidoost, waarbij we verschillende tentoonstellingen maken en contextprogramma's maken rondom die tentoonstellingen. En zoveel mogelijk samenwerken met organisaties, curatoren, die volgens ons te weinig een podium krijgen. En dat doen we met heel veel plezier. We zijn met z'n 17, waarvan iedereen eigenlijk gewoon freelancer is. En dat eigenlijk.
Ja. Fijn ook dat je erbij kan zijn, dankjewel.
Yes.
Alles wat je hebt ondernomen, ook daar gaan we nog meer van horen vanavond.
Yes.
En last but not least, Daan van Dartel. Curator, conservator populaire culturen bij het Nationaal Museum Van Wereldculturen in Amsterdam. Jij zit nu ook in Nederland.
Waar ben je? Ik zit in de Meren bij Utrecht. Aan het water.
Heerlijk.
Spelende kinderen buiten.
Kijk. Nou, jij cureerde natuurlijk, or switch to English for everyone to understand. You curated the exhibition Fashion Cities African in 2016. And in your job, you have a critical view of the Western, the Western view on fashion. You were also part of our board with the Voices of Fashion exhibition, Erica as well. By the way, I forgot to say. And you will moderate this talk.
Yeah.
Would you like to add something to this?
Not necessarily, no. Just to say that I think that all 4 of us, 5, Ninke, you as well, I think we're up to a pretty tough job in decolonizing fashion and in getting stuff into a different direction than from where it always went. And I think that this talk will be mostly about that, but I'm not sure where it will go. So we'll see. Yeah,
it connects us indeed, and I think what connects us as well is the exhibition Voices of Fashion, co-curated by Janice Deul and Anne-Carlijn van Kesteren and myself. And but the main important it's an exhibition at the Centraal Museum in Utrecht, still on show till August 15. And I couldn't have done it without you guys, Lesiba, being a participant in the exhibition, and with all the designers, and so I think we can take it away.
Okay. So I would like to invite all of us to ask questions to each other. So let's have a conversation, not so much a moderated talk, but more or less a conversation, because I think we're all involved, invested in the same thing from different perspectives. So I would say that I come from an institutional perspective in a museum, which is quite a different dynamic than I would guess a research institution as Lesiba's and Erica's, which is AFRI, and again, a different context than OSCAM has in Amsterdam Zuidoost. So I hope that we can get to the core of business. And I just wanted to start with AFRI to get some more on what AFRI exactly is. And I took this from your website, or a document that I saw, which is that in 2019, I was going 100 years earlier, if that were true. 2019, you established AFRI, which is a digital and physical platform for knowledge creation and curation for fronting contemporary African fashion stories, aesthetics, politics, and poetics. So that's quite a large enterprise, right? So I thought maybe Lesiba, you could start with explaining us a bit more about what AFRI is and what it does.
Okay, so I guess AFRI was what we had envisioned towards the end of our tenure at Zuid-Smoka. This was after we had staged the first fashion exhibition in a museum on the continent.
Because, Zuid-Smoka is a museum, sorry.
Yes,
right?
It is.
Just for those who don't know.
Okay, yes.
Yeah.
It's a contemporary museum, and it's based in Cape Town.
Okay.
And that's where me and Erica kind of worked together. I think AFRI kind of stemmed out of both our beliefs within this idea of an African fashion that speaks from an African sort of center, not necessarily from what is said about Africa. We believe that we should own our own stories and our own legacies, and that we should create our own handbook into how we study African fashion. But particularly the aim of our work came about during one of the other exhibitors in this exhibition called Teva Magubu. And he had a show in London for the International Fashion Showcase. So there was a vested interest from us as this fashion department to bring that to the museum. But unfortunately, we had issues in terms of finance. And then we kind of figured out, actually, there's other ways to create this knowledge, because one of our pushing sort of driving forces within creating AFRI was, how do we bring the achievements of Africans overseas to people on the continent who can't afford a plane ticket. And so that's when we ventured into this idea that we had been theorizing beforehand, but actually became a reality in this work, but to kind of create a digital sort of space, or to have an institution that lives within the digital space, so that there is a democratic process to it, not necessarily just a democratic element to participation, but possibilities of contributing to this digital sphere of Africa. Because I think with institutions out there, there's this idea that there are individuals at the top who tell us about the work. We wanted a situation where people from any part of the African continent would be able to contribute with the knowledge that they have, in a way decentralizing where knowledge is created, and also aligning with our decolonial views. So that's where it started. And yeah, ever since we've been trying to work on a sort of digital sort of basis with our work, exploring new ways to create or to research issues around African fashion from the African continent, but at the same time, be able to reach as many people as possible through digital means.
And Erica, I don't know if you want to say more to that, or if you, or perhaps about your different roles in AFRI. Because if I understood well, you met at MOCA Tijdens. You met there, or did you meet before? Where did you meet?
We met just prior to that. I was doing my PhD and Lesiba was doing his master's, and we were both studying at the University of Cape Town. And we were invited into a panel discussion. So we met in a panel discussion. And then the conversation continued from there. So then when I joined the Zionist Museum of Contemporary African Art in their fashion department as the curator, I then worked together with Lesiba in that department. But I think Lesiba sort of, really pointing to one of the sort of key driving forces that we're really underpinned by this idea around access, and access to information is one sort of the directions. So housing and holding information around fashion from the continent, whether it's contemporary or whether it's historic, there's such an absence of an archive of African fashion on the continent, and there's an absence of an African fashion archive elsewhere, but we're aware of that as well. So one is to try and create a space where this knowledge can start to congregate, kind of like a meeting place for this information, but also to make it accessible outward again. And I think in these COVID times, it's really become much more sensitized around having access to just jump on a train and go to Paris for an exhibition, or jump on a train and go to London for an exhibition. In Europe, these things were kind of the norm. You could travel to an exhibition, but in the global South, you can't just travel to an exhibition because there's a great exhibition. It's an enormous expense to get to an exhibition. So it's usually tagged along with a range of other things. So this idea of distance on the African continent has kept these conversations so disparate. So our capacity now as a digital platform have conversations with colleagues in Ghana or colleagues in Kenya or colleagues in Zimbabwe, sharing information around their work, seeing their works and hearing about, you know, the ongoing projects. This has completely opened up the platform for us.
Has this improved in COVID times then even, or did you already have, I noticed that for my regular job, it's much more digital everything, but in your case, that was already the case then?
Well, because we had just established ourselves in 2019, so we were really small. So we're 2 years old. So of that 2 years, you know, 3/4 of it has been driven by the context. And at the moment, we're really just growing quite slowly in terms of our networks, building infrastructures, having conversation, having the dialogue. So I think Lesiba is right in sort of saying it's a two-way process. One, us reaching out, but also the other where we're wanting and we're creating spaces for people to interact with us around our work.
Okay, because in that, how come you think, because you say archive and access to information which was lacking on fashion from the African continent, so to say, worldwide actually. And I don't know if you or Lesiba can answer, where does that come from, you think? And I can imagine an answer, but how is it that there is no proper archive on fashion from the continent? Can we find this in our history? Probably.
I mean, I'm happy to respond fairly briefly, but the real big distinction is the colonial distinction. So fashion was a Western concept, and dress was what happened in the rest, in the non-West or the colonial colonized world. So this distinction of dress and fashion followed every single material development across the African continent, you know, for the last 200 years. So fashion objects from and I'm speaking just from South Africa, fashion objects from the 1940s and the 1950s by designers in South Africa were not collected by museums because they didn't belong to the fashion department or the fashion lexicon. So this exclusion through a colonial lens, and it's really only in the last, you know, 10 years that there's been a real pushback to actually put these two words together, Africa and fashion. You know, just even that has been, you know, there's still these terms that condition garb and costume and dress. These are and tradition. These are the weight that has been that has kept these conversations out of a fashion studies and a fashion history. The textbooks do it, the museums do it, the fashion education institutions do it.
And I mean, if you add to that, it doesn't necessarily only stop with fashion. I mean, coming as an individual who obviously went to school in South Africa, you rarely hear stories about your ancestors or your background. The last time I think we did do any sort of history regarding South Africa's sort of African roots are related to Shaka Zulu or, you know, apartheid, and it's limited to those events. It never really goes further than that. It never talks about people who should be remembered, inventors, thinkers, and obviously that has found its way into our fashion curriculum. When I was at school, we never learned about anything other than modernizing an African sort of the idea that we had to modernize an African sort of cultural form of dress, as Erica has mentioned. So yeah, we found that it was very important to speak to that, as we are aware that there are a lot more I guess conversations to be had around African fashion, around African aesthetics, around the ways that Africans are existing and using fashion as a lens.
So is it so that in the Netherlands, obviously with a very different perspective coming from a very different part in the colonial, what I saw in my museum and what you see also in other museums like fashion museums is that the ethnography, so-called ethnographic dress, like Erica said, the costume, the dress, the all these terms that everything but fashion is used for clothing outside of the West, so to say. They were collected, but they were collected in these specific ethnography museums that are about the other. So they were used in othering. And how were these then? Because Lesiba, you say in your history classes you never heard about them. Did you also not hear about them, but then from this ethnological perspective? And were they collected in like folk museums or ethnographic museums, and then within such a colonial look upon these ways of clothing, of dressing?
Well, relating to the curriculum, if I could pull out a file, I would, because I have it here. We started collecting from Egypt, and then we moved to Mesopotamia, and then it gradually went into European existence. So it never really delved further within what was African. And I think that was a little bit, it kind of just showed you exactly where the idea of fashion was concentrated towards, just by the books, just by, you know, what they covered.
And did you have ethnography museums that collected, so other types of museums that collected dress, ethnographic dress, so to say?
Yeah, maybe let me,
Yeah. Mm-hmm. You can go, Erica, it's fine.
Okay, no, just because I was going to say, Dan, that my PhD really looked at three museums that then merged in 2013, merged into one museum, but their dress and fashion collections had belonged to an ethnographic museum, an art museum, and a cultural history museum, and they were trying to bring these three dress and fashion collections together that had very different taxonomies, very different tropes for exhibiting, very different records and classifications, and also very different languages around them. And they struggle, 20 years after the end of apartheid still, to try and bring a conversation between them. So a really, really, really divided, and not just divided between the colonized and the colonizer, but in South Africa it was really a racial divide, and so a real problematic space that was existing in museums, and a real sort of, I would say also a real opportunity to intervene in those spaces, to start to have new kinds of conversations that are far more confrontational.
So, but if I understood well, you're not at SiteMocha anymore, Erica?
No,
are you?
No.
So the putting together of these three collections with a different history of collecting fashion, if I can say it like that. How did that end, or where did that? Is it still going on? Is it not happening? Where do you think it will go?
So the three different museums that formed one museum is the Zico Museum. It's a national museum. So that is not the Zeitz Museum. The Zeitz Museum decided to focus specifically and only and quite clearly on contemporary fine art. Mm-hmm. And so there was a second battle that played out, and this was the battle between art and fashion. Yeah. So we have another conversation there. When is it art and when is it fashion? So they
that's interesting.
They decided to focus on art and not to take up a fashion program.
But they did have a fashion collection, right?
No, they don't.
Oh, okay. I thought so. You were normally you were responsible to go and start that collection. Yeah. That was the idea, right? Okay, yeah. So AFRI is a sort of reaction to all these circumstances. misschien Marian,
Ja.
is OSCAM dat ook wel? Hè? Een reactie op bestaande musea en wat ze niet bieden. Of wat ze bieden, maar niet aan iedereen. Ik weet niet of je daar iets over kan zeggen.
Ik denk dat OSCAM een reactie is op actuele maatschappelijke thema's. Dus ook dit. En ik denk dat OSCAM een aanvulling is en aanjager is om ervoor te zorgen dat voor en achter de schermen meer people of color de gelegenheid krijgen om hun verhalen te vertellen. Op hun eigen manier, vanuit hun eigen roots, zonder kaders die Europese musea's of kunstinstellingen vaak stellen. Dus ik denk dat OSCAM is. En ik denk dat het OSCAM-team, die echt overal vandaan komt, wat betreft culturele achtergrond, ook een, hoe zeg je dat? Ja, het team van de toekomst is bijvoorbeeld. Ik denk dat dat het is, waarbij ik hoop dat ze uiteindelijk gaan uitvliegen, nu nog niet, in ieder geval, maar in ieder geval binnenkort naar andere instituten en kunstinstellingen en musea, zodat ze daar ook de gelegenheid krijgen om vooral 100% zichzelf te zijn als professional. Dat is wat ik denk dat OSCAM vooral is. En OSCAM is ook zoekende om ervoor te zorgen dat hetgeen wat we doen ook op meerdere plekken landt. Ja, dan alleen binnen Zuidoost of binnen Amsterdam of binnen Nederland.
Ja, wat ik dan een interessante vraag vind, tenminste die kwam bij mij op, of die dan interessant is, weet ik niet. Maar je zegt buiten de Europese idee van wat een museum zou moeten zijn, hè, dat je daar als OSCAM een soort aanvulling op bent. En Erica en Lesiba, so AFRI is a research institute, and I was intrigued by the terms like research institute and also the term for OSCAM museum. Mm-hmm. These are again European-led or invented colonial ways of organizing or way of dispensing knowledge, of spreading knowledge, is the research institute. For me, they not immediately, but thinking about it, encompass actually what you also oppose against. So where does this terminology come in? So would you have called it maybe not museum, but you did. So why was that, Marian?
Ik vind het een hele goede vraag en een hele goede constatering. Thanks. En we hebben daar bewust voor gekozen om ook te schuren. Want sommige mensen zeggen instituut, instelling, culturele instelling. Sommige mensen zeggen gallery. Maar wij blijven het woord museum, hoe zeg je dat, gebruiken, omdat we ervan overtuigd zijn dat een museum niet zo standaard eruit zou moeten zien zoals de gemiddelde museum in Nederland. Laat ik het daar maar even op houden. Dus we blijven de term gebruiken, omdat we uiteindelijk wat we doen, we researchen ook eigenlijk op onze eigen manier. En piloten ook heel veel tentoonstellingen bij ons die daarna uitvliegen naar andere organisaties. Dus het is eigenlijk het herdefiniëren van het woord. En daarom dat we er bewust voor het woord museum voor hebben gekozen. En dat een heleboel mensen, organisaties vinden dat het niet zo is. Maar dat is juist de manier om een beetje te schuren, te rebelleren misschien zelfs. En met als doelstelling om wel het museum te zijn van de toekomst. Maar ik vind het een hele mooie vraag eigenlijk. Ja. Dus, en niemand die ons dat stelt. Dus dat vind ik wel grappig dat jij die vraag stelt. Dankjewel.
Ja, wij zijn natuurlijk wel echt bij uitstek een museum. Het Nationaal Museum van Wereldculturen, voortgekomen zelfs deels uit een koloniaal museum. Dat was de naam van het Tropenmuseum in de vorige eeuw, de eeuw daarvoor. En zelfs wij zoeken naar wat betekent die term nou? En zijn ons heel erg bewust dat het een westerse manier is van kennis ordenen en presenteren. Ja. En als je dan hebt, als je het dan hebt over decoloniseren, dat het dan heel lastig is vanuit dat perspectief. Dus daarom vroeg ik me inderdaad af van, goh, waarom is OSCAM een museum geworden? Maar ik begrijp het antwoord heel goed, ja.
Ja.
Ja, dat is waar je naartoe wil, wat een museum kan zijn. En
Ja.
niet per se wat een museum nu is.
Ja, want een museum
Dat,
hoeft niet bijvoorbeeld 4 muren te hebben. Snap je?
Ja, ja.
Een museum kan van alles zijn. En als aanvulling daarop, ik ben gevraagd door de Hogeschool van de Kunsten Utrecht als fellow. En ze hebben gevraagd of ik research wil doen naar een bepaald thema, onderwerp. En ik heb er dus ook voor gekozen om het woord museum te herdefiniëren, zeg maar per september de komende 3 jaar.
Wat goed.
Omdat ik vind dat het woord een bepaalde lading heeft, een bepaalde zwaarte, een bepaalde arrogantie, een bepaalde waarde, waarvan ik vind dat je dat met z'n allen opnieuw zou kunnen inrichten. En dat was eigenlijk helemaal geen antwoord op je vraag voor de rest. Maar dat wil ik even meegeven.
Nee,
omdat ik het zo tof vind dat jij die vraag stelt. En een andere organisatie heeft ook nog die vraag gesteld. En die vindt helemaal, dat kan je helemaal niet maken, kan je niet doen. Hoe durf je, et cetera, et cetera. Dus dat vond ik wel heel fijn in het begin. Maar toen heb ik er bewust voor gekozen, toen we nog een naam bedachten, nou, dan gaan we lekker wel doen. Dus ja.
Nou, dat zegt ook wel wat over het karakter van OSCAM natuurlijk. In dat je inderdaad bestaande paden niet in wil gaan.
Ja. En ik ben ook wel benieuwd naar het antwoord van Erica en Lesiba. Why did you choose the word Research Institute? Instead of another word.
Firstly, just to acknowledge what Marianne was saying is that, and it's such an important thing, is like choosing the word museum to kind of reclaim it and give it another dimension and another definition, and to kind of occupy the space with a different set of principles, a different set of bodies, a different set of voices that can shift the meaning, and not to shy away from the word museum in that instance is the same thing that we chose in terms of saying African fashion. Why did we want to use this term fashion in the same way as a kind of Western-centric, Western dominant idea that has had such negative colonial impact? And could we not maybe have considered another term, but to take the term and to occupy that space and to occupy it on our terms, I think was really important. And so we very clearly chose the terms fashion. And then I think maybe just in terms of research is to say that I think there's been so much study of fashion from the continent by others, by American researchers, by French researchers, by Italian researchers, by studying fashions from the continent, and to claim that as an Afrocentric idea and possibility, that we can and we do think about what we do when we're talking about fashion. There are sort of a real sort of criticality that's been disavowed on the continent. So you're a maker, and you're maybe a storyteller, but you're a maker and a storyteller, but you're not a thinker at the same time. So it's to include that thinking and that criticality. And I think that's completely central to Lesiba's work. So I don't know if you want to come in there around the research.
Ja, en wie is eigenlijk de eigenaar van woorden en letters? Snap je? Dus we zijn allemaal eigenaar van alles wat ooit is bedacht of verwoord of is ontwikkeld. Dus ja, dat was wel nog iets wat ik wilde.
Yeah, so Marianne sort of saying who actually owns
words. Yeah.
And who.
This is exactly where I was going to come in there. It's a matter of saying, there's a clash between what the word is and what the word does.
And what the
and in my opinion, what the word does means that for us it's a space, and I say space because that's what we actually had it as before we went for the AFRI. It was the African Fashion Research Space. But there's a sense of relatability that we wanted to also work with, and therefore the AFRI became a much more attractive name. But yeah, it does work with this idea of that for a long time, an institution, yes, by definition, comes from Western European sort of origin, but what it does suggests that nobody or no other society in the world had some sort of, you know, a sharing or a gathering or an assemblance of authority on particular subjects, and they are there. There are forms of institutions that exist, but you know, they were never really given that sort of, you know, platform, if I have to put it in that sort of, for lack of a better term. The other thing is you don't want to also come across as overtly or overtly exotic or exoticizing the idea of the fact that, or romanticizing the idea that you come from an African sort of origin. You could call it an African fashion research imbizo, but I think that kind of becomes something else in its sense. It's you don't want to detract from the seriousness of what we're trying to do. And that's purely where I come from. And I think, as Daan, you understand as well, with when you were in Leiden, you were speaking with Rolando Vasquez, and their terminology is also very important. In fact, they use aesthesis as opposed to aesthetic. But it took a while before they got to the point where they could say, rather, let's kind of focus on a phenomenological sort of experience of it. And I think because we're so young, we're still pushing towards a different sort of, you know, existence, but also redefining what an institution can do. And so based on our projects, I think that speaks more louder than what, you know, our colonial formation of the word would suggest.
I love these answers because it's a struggle that I often have also with other people in that you use the concept of fashion to decolonize our collections, our say world culture collections, if you want to talk about exotic terminology. Mm-hmm. So I really thank you guys for you mm-hmm. know, talking more about this. It's really good to look at it from that perspective. Maybe Lesiba, you can say something about your work that continues from this this idea. So also the work that is in the exhibition in Utrecht in Centraal Museum. I don't know. Yeah, I think we're going to see it in a moment. So, yeah, maybe you could say something about that.
So the work that I have in the museum stems from my research, or my MA research in theatre and performance, not really fashion design. Mm-hmm. But I think what happened was that by studying theatre and performance, I started to engage with a different form or method of criticality, inquiry, and I centered the body in my research, as opposed to, you know, how I'd been taught within fashion school. It was, you know, the object of the garment that was centered around your research. So within that, started to look at how suits were formed and the cultural significance of suits, not only in, I guess, a global perspective, but also in the African perspective, and especially as it relates to masculinities. So the suit in itself, I was looking at how the construction of the suit was somewhat a pseudo idea or pseudo sort of idealistic idea of Roman, Greek ideologies from the West, and how that was superimposed or imposed onto colonial Black male bodies during the colonial period. The idea was to kind of look at our past and see how through those relations of masculinities, we could create a unique idea of what African men could look like. Obviously bringing in a lot from the past, but also examples of how suits had been deconstructed through the history of fashion. The idea was that the suit in its formation was had embedded into its construction, was making a sort of a violent idea of masculinity. And these were made in connections with the uniform and the general physique of the garment. And then so from that perspective, I wanted to kind of also create a capsule collection that kind of reversed the mode or the modes between, this idea of African masculinities, because when I did start with my research, it was taking this blanket which signified a form of masculinity or rites of passage, and I made that into this suit. The reason for that was because in certain cultures within the South African context, particularly Xhosa and Bedi, which I'm Bedi, there's a process of going to rites of passage. You obviously go through the circumcision ritual, but then thereafterwards you are asked to wear a suit. And the idea of that was that, in my visual, the way I was thinking about it visually was that what is determined to be a real man is a European form of a man, not necessarily the African form of man. And so my inquiry was to swap those, or to question these sorts of outlooks from ourselves, based on not just the shape of the suit, but also the materiality of the suit. But then obviously taking into the fact that, before colonialism, there was an existing aesthetic. And so the idea was to kind of look through those ideas, and those come from anthropometric imagery of how Africans kind of wore their garments before, or during the whole missionary excavations, but at the same time enlisting other examples of where the suit had been, given a different sort of form. So Japanese design, and also philosophies of Japanese design, such as Ma, came into that sort of idea. And that way I created the range or the capsule collection that the garments in the exhibition come from. The idea of just making it softer, but also working on characteristics that are most prevalent on the continent and maybe also in the diaspora. So those are like drape as an aesthetic. And I wanted to work with that idea because obviously that's when you have a fabric that is kind of seen as a classic symbol of tailoring and you soften it, it kind of adds these levels of contradictions, right? But also, it questions these ideas, these ideals of Europeanness, and that is, within sexuality and perception. The museum that we worked at Zeitz was a really interesting sort of situation because how, that range would go on to create Reinstitute. And the way that I kind of saw it was that there are institutions and there are code of conduct in terms of how we are meant to dress in institutions, which are likened to, military uniformity. And so this idea that a collectiveness is happening within the institution. So a collective culture of violent masculinity exists within the institution. So the idea was to question, as you did with the AFRI, was to question the validity of Zeitz Mocha as an African institution. And therefore instilling the garments, getting the staff to wear the garments as well. So creating, in some sense, a flash mob. So just by the presence of them, they are questioning the validity of the museum as an African institution. Particularly the fact that they're cultural as well.
Was that a problem for the museum?
No, I think it depends on how we see it, but the fact that I think they tend to have an issue as us as being a fashion department within the museum. But other than that, I think the participants or the employees took well to it. They really enjoyed the whole process. I think what I took away from it was the comments that they told me was that many of them felt that they felt very regal in the items, and it was mostly men that kind of told me that sort of, or gave me that sort of feedback. But also what I really enjoyed about it was that it reflected the principles of mine that, you know, garments were created in a way that also took into account the fit issues that we have of African bodies. And therefore, you know, one garment could fit multiple bodies. And therefore, in a sense, it was democratic. But also the fact that individuals from different, how would I put it, departments within the museum wore the same kind of garments made the experience democratic as well. So you had the security guard and the curatorial assistants wearing somewhat the same sort of collection, which doesn't necessarily happen, and specifically at Tijdens didn't happen until that point.
Interesting, so many layers then in your work.
Yes,
that you would need you to be standing next to the garments in the museum to really explain what it all does. And I was wondering how, because you then make your own work, but then you with Erica are AFRI as a research institute and located in South Africa, but AFRI is about the whole continent. And I was wondering how in Earth's name are you going to get people to know you and to get programs or projects from the ground when you are about this enormous space and in this enormous differences in cultures and this enormous diversity in how you are, of course, you're online, so your location's not really relevant, but still, how do you approach this enormous continent in trying to get to work within AFRI? I don't know if that makes sense, that question, but
no, it does.
If it's clear.
It certainly does. I mean, this is why we named it digital or AFRI digital. The digital element is very important in that we recognize the fact that we couldn't do that. We couldn't do that on our own. In actual fact, you're replicating the ills of the past. We think that we're going to do that on our own, that we're going to just fly to Togo and figure out how things have worked and then write it and therefore we release it. No, the idea was to have, you know, individuals from different spaces tell their own stories about a particular artifact, and therefore you're creating a large encyclopedia regarding one particular garment, for instance. And I think the whole idea of digital, it actually almost happened other than the exhibition, but us as a working sort of partnership, the fact that we are remote kind of, you know, we had been practicing that before the whole pandemic hit, and the way we are kind of now, you know, seen as a normal sort of exchange in terms of Zoom. We had already been working in those sorts of spaces, and so that's how we see ourselves collecting as much information about the African continent. It happens easier and it happens much more, or I think it's much more rewarding when you allow people to tell their own stories. And that's what we aim to do in terms of the projects. But also, you know, we especially for me, I don't necessarily have a research institute that was looking towards a fashion design or interdisciplinary fashion designer and to give them a platform. I mean, for a long time, my platform was in performance art realms, but I couldn't necessarily exercise another part of myself, which was research within the spaces of fashion design. And so that's what AFRI becomes for me. It becomes that lens or a home for that sort of intellectual exercise, but also for future designers who are interested in this sort of inquiry.
And then if anybody has a question, please do, because I keep rambling on. I'll ask questions all the time. So please just jump in.
I was going to just share the International Fashion Showcase project that Lesiba mentioned. So that was Tebe Magugo's showcased at that exhibition in London, and it was a 2-week exhibition that happened in London together with 16 other designers from around the world. And so this idea to try and bring that exhibition back to the continent, and how do you bring an exhibition back to the continent? So we brought it back as a digital exhibition. And that digital exhibition, what we then did is we could then add an additional layer into that digital exhibition. So we filmed interviews with Tebe, and there were 2 other African designers, so Amidoshi Shah from Kenya and Cedric Meziro from Rwanda. So we could then extend their story, so the exhibition as a visual, but then we could add an additional layer of dialogue, of voice, of articulation. I think, Marianne, you were suggesting this, how important it is that different kinds of narratives and different voices are heard. And so that exhibition opportunity to bring the exhibition then to an accessible place that anybody, anywhere can access that exhibition through a digital link, as if you had actually gone to visit the exhibition. So that was one of the projects that showcases those kinds of invitations to collaborate. Yeah.
Yeah, and then Marianne, OSCAM is a space, is a physical space, so you work very differently. Can you say something about how your projects come into being? I think that I find that interesting. I don't know.
Ja, het is op basis van actualiteit, denk ik, zoveel mogelijk. Op basis van thema's die ingaan op de actualiteit. Maar het is ook de keuze aan partners met wie we samenwerken, denk ik. En ook de keuze van curatoren die we selecteren klinkt een beetje heftig, maar met wie we graag samenwerken. En we proberen ook zoveel mogelijk buiten OSCAM ook onszelf zoveel mogelijk te laten zien. Dus nu bijvoorbeeld met het Centraal Museum Utrecht, maar ook regelmatig met de Hogeschool van Amsterdam. Regelmatig met Nationaal Opera en Ballet. Om het niet binnen Zuidoost te houden, maar ook daarbuiten. Dat.
Okay. En komen mensen met ideeën naar jou toe?
Onze mailbox
ben
is
jij
wel...
ze aan het...
Nee, de mailbox is wel extreem vol. Dus we zeggen ook dat we ook echt... We zitten ook echt vol tot en met eind 2022, 2023. Wat wel jammer is, waardoor je bepaalde actualiteit soms mist. En geen plek kan geven. Dus eigenlijk zijn we qua locatie veel te klein. We zijn ook op zoek naar een grotere locatie. We maken net als iedereen een 1 jaar, 2-jarig programma. Waar al best wel veel vaststaat. Maar doordat we speak sessions hebben ontwikkeld. Dat zijn vraaggesprekken rondom tentoonstellingen en programma's die we maken. Krijgen we de gelegenheid om toch nog dieper op actualiteit in te gaan.
Ja, en ik zit te denken... je zei net dat je mensen klaar wil stomen, hè? Dat ze doorontwikkelen en de museumwereld in kunnen. En ik zit me nog steeds vanuit mijn eigen achtergrond, vanuit die museumwereld waar ze in zouden kunnen stromen dan. Bij ons is vaak de discussie, zijn wij nog relevant als museum? En dat proberen we natuurlijk op allerlei manieren wel voor elkaar te krijgen. Waarbij ik dan toch het idee heb dat zo'n OSCAM of AFRI meer relevant lijkt dan dat grote logge instituut waar je zelf toe behoort, zeg maar. In mijn geval. Wat is dan mijn vraag?
Ja, ik denk niet dat... ik denk dat iedereen moet kunnen bestaan naast elkaar. En dat je elkaar gewoon kan aanvullen. En open moet staan voor nieuwe verhalen. Het is niet zo dat... ik vind de een niet minder relevant of meer relevant dan de ander. Het is alleen wel zo dat ik vind dat organisaties, instituten, musea meer out of the box zouden moeten willen kunnen denken. En niet per se om een vinkje af te strepen. Ja. Omdat ze dan voldoen aan een bepaalde subsidie, omdat ze heel erg divers zijn. Of voldoen aan meerstemmige, weet ik veel, kwaliteiten voor een subsidieaanvraag of een sponsoring.
Ja, ik snap het. Ja.
Dus het is klaarstomen klinkt, ja, dat heb ik volgens mij zelf gezegd, maar wat ik daarmee bedoel is dat je, ze zijn voornamelijk allemaal autodidact. En het zijn geen collega's die hoe noem je dat? Kunstgeschiedenis hebben gedaan of iets dergelijks. Maar wel verhalen meebrengen die vaak voor mijzelf ook heel vaak nieuw zijn. Omdat ze voornamelijk wel veel jonger zijn dan ik, ruim 20 jaar jonger. En dat vind ik mezelf al jong, dus dan kan je nagaan. En die verhalen moeten verteld worden en die moeten verspreid worden. En of je nou net start als junior curator of uitvoerend curator of junior producer. Het kan overal verteld worden. En het moet ook overal verteld worden.
Erica and Lesiba, are you working also with you two? I see you two as sort of the instigators or the leaders, or let's get rid of all these terms, but by lack of terminology, I don't know what else to say, the establishers of AFRI. Do you work with, you offer people opportunity to grow in this idea around fashion, decolonizing fashion, and museums actually is the other side of that question. Is that something that is also part of your future, your idea of what AFRI can be?
I think in the same way that Marianne is speaking about mentorships and working with a very diverse, much more diverse kind of range of researchers, I think a very key point is with fashion designers to create a space where we can create research affiliations or research associateships. So we're trying to develop these relationships across the board. But one of the things that we really are working also is in education. So in the same way that the museum has seen, the impact of COVID has seen, the basics of what a museum is, a public that engages with objects has been kind of had such a disruptive year and a half, but education in the same way has also been completely disrupted. So there are all these new openings, these new possibilities. So maybe that's what we are. We're at that place where we can just take an opportunity in some of these new gaps that have been created. A lot of educational institutions either haven't been adept at getting new digital material out there. So kind of thinking about education differently, thinking about academia differently, thinking about like what is deemed as the right kind of knowledge pathway or journey. So we've done some interesting, Lesiba's project on the cutting room, which was also a digital project that allowed for very different kinds of stories to come to the fore through asking very different questions. So as a kind of public educational space about a fashion history that would otherwise have remained buried or continue to remain on the side of a fashion story. So I think these kinds of gaps, so in terms of knowledge production or knowledge creation and then knowledge sharing, and museums would be one of the spaces. We're in conversation with a number of different kinds of institutions, and museums is one, educational institutions is another.
So there are actually quite a lot of overeenkomsten, similarities, right, between OSCAM and then...
We have to work together, we have to meet.
Exactly. Here was something that came up. So how might that look? How is your futures? How are they for you? And do take this with you, like a sort of collaboration. But what does the future look like for, let's say, the short future? Because the long future, we have no clue what that will be. But what are your plans, Marian, Erica, and Lesiba, for the near future? Do you have specific projects coming up? Marian?
We zijn aan het pitchen voor een groter gebouw. Dus dat hopen we rond 2024, 2025 te hebben. Waardoor we nog meer kunnen ontwikkelen en laten zien. En beter kunnen inspringen op de actualiteit. Op korte termijn is 2021 overleven. Op lange termijn is onze internationale samenwerkingen aansterken. Omdat die op stapel lagen begin van corona. Maar we hebben nooit naar Zimbabwe kunnen gaan. We hebben nooit naar Londen kunnen gaan. We zijn nu bezig met een project met Senegal. Wat elk moment online komt. Maar ja, we willen daar natuurlijk ook graag naartoe. En dat de mensen ook hier naartoe komen. Dus de internationale kansen willen we gaan benutten in de toekomst. En ja, dat is het eigenlijk.
En dus Zuid-Afrika?
Ja.
Dat would be nice. And for AFRI, what is the near and the further future for AFRI?
I think one of the projects that we really wanting to explore is also just how to strengthen those collaborations and those partnerships. As a research institute, our strengths are really in thinking critically around fashion and working with fashion as a kind of tool to heal, which is really necessary, to question, to create safe spaces for those difficult conversations, and then maybe to look at collaborations with digital partners. I think we've only just really seen the start of what I think is a much bigger cultural shift in terms of where the role of art, the role of fashion as a place of dream, as a place of imagination, as a place of reconnecting, and a recognition of histories, a recognition of meanings, new kinds of languages. And the digital is a very possible space to network. So we're really looking for engaging that, on the continent. And we also, would love international dialogue. Absolutely open to that. Lesiba, I don't know if you want to add to the short and long term.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the work that I do kind of finds itself segued into, AFRI, because there is a lot of research that goes into it in any case. But certainly building on those affiliateships through projects. So, we have been thinking about proposals to do reinstitute in other museums. There's another museum in South Africa here in Gauteng that we've been approaching to kind of see how that can manifest. And also personally, it's just creating new collections. That's what's in my head right now, just to kind of get that going. There are new inquiries, there's certainly new inquiries, and I think it is based, it's a work in progress, but it's also based on, the last project which we did, which was the cutting room project. So it was online largely, and so we're looking for a home to put it into a physical realm so that people can engage with it instead of, through the web, which is traditionally has been observed. So that's something that I feel very strongly about. It would be really nice to have it in Cape Town, but also be nice to have a partner institution to carry us, specifically ones that are digitally inclined. So yeah, we're pushing for that. Yeah, I think there's a few ideas. It's just a matter of aligning them together. I mean, we're trying to think about how radio as well could be explored as a medium to discuss fashion, as opposed to this idea of it being a visual sort of canvas. Can it also be can it be the way to kind of discuss issues of our identity or masculinities, and how to do that, which partners, etc., etc. But yeah, it's just a matter of just growing AFRI as well, making the more the people get involved, the more diverse the projects become, and the more interesting we become as well.
Okay, so I have a million other questions that we really would need to do with drink some time. But I think Ninke, perhaps, I don't know.
Yeah, I was, but I was also curious about your own plans.
Oh, our own futures. Well, actually, today I am hearing about our museums. So we have 4 museums, and we have a reorganization going on. And today we will hear about this new management structure. And I don't really know what the future is going to hold. The only thing is that what I can dream, we were talking about dreaming and imagination, is that fashion, and as I call it, as a decolonial tool, maybe, will be more prevalent in our museums in the coming years. I hope, and I think that might be true, but maybe if one of my managers is now watching, we'll think, well, we'll have to see about that. But so I don't know, but I have big expectations that we may explore a different view on fashion that has been prevalent until now. And I hope that I will be part of that discussion. And I hope you all will be part of that discussion with us too. And I also hope that this talk will lead to new, collaborations. I think that might be really interesting. Yeah.
That sounds very interesting. I think we've heard so many stories, and just like you said, Dan, I think we can talk a lot longer. Things that I've noticed, things that I've heard. Well, it was a lot of information, but I think to cooperate together, that's what we can bring us all, can help us all in the future. So, and I'm very interested in the discussions about museums and fashion, as we are a museum with a big fashion collection, and I think it's also the idea of othering and cooperating, and the idea of the team of the future. So I hope we can all be part of that. That would be great. There are some beautiful initiatives like Museum Bekende Kleur, as well in the Netherlands, and Modeconservator. I think it can all make us stronger. So. And I'm really happy with this talk because Erica and I were dreaming about having a conference as like a closure conference for the exhibition, and really happy that we can do it like in a smaller way, digital. And I'm still dreaming of a physical conference one day in the future. And also, like you said, Lesiba, with words, what it is and what it does. I think what words do. Well, Dan, the organization came up with the book Words Matter, and I think that's also a very important thing. And and accessibility. So yeah, there's still a lot of work to do, and everybody, yeah, contributing in its own way. And I'm really happy that you were able to share your thoughts with us, with the public. And perhaps if there are any questions for all of you, they can email the museum, and we can forward it. And let's hope there will be more dialogues and more talks, and a change. That's what's really needed, I guess. So yeah, thank you so much, and yeah, hope it will be continued.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks. Bye. Bye-bye.